Today's guest on Adversity to Strength with Lee Freeman is Jeff Sorensen, a true force of nature. Jeff is a transformational leader, international facilitator, speaker, and co-author of the international best-selling book, Ignite Your Inner Spirit. He spent nearly 20 years helping people, especially those in leadership or aspiring to lead, break through self-doubt, self-sabotage, and limiting beliefs. His mission is to empower others to stop playing small, align with their purpose, and to step fully into the impactful leaders they were born to be. Jeff is also founder of Breath Army and the Light Force Training Academy. His work blends embodied wisdom, deep healing, purpose-driven action to help people reclaim their power, heal past trauma, and unlock their full potential. It's an honor to have Jeff here. Jeff, thank you ever so much for coming on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me on, Lee. I'm happy to be here.
Appreciate your time. Take us back to the beginning for yourself. Where did your journey start?
Yeah, well, it's been a long journey, as we've all had. And I'd like to start with a story that really encapsulates a really pivotal moment in my life. And that happened back on October 23rd, 2003. I was looking at my body as it was lying in the back of an ambulance, and the nurse in the back, the ambulance, and my body were covered in blood. And I'm drifting further and further away. And I hear a voice in my head that says to me, you can keep drifting off or you can go back, but there will be a lot of suffering if you do. And yet there was a knowing within me that I needed to go back. And so, boom, instantly, I'm back in my body. I rip off the straps on the spine board. I rip off the hard collar and yell at the paramedics, take me back to the hospital, because I knew that I wasn't going to survive the transport to the ICU that was over 2 hours away. And so flash forward, I'm back living my life, but the pain and the injuries from the accident piled on top of a mountain of childhood trauma are so bad that I'm now on oxys, benzos, SSRIs, and I'm also partying and self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. So basically, every morning I'm waking up and I'm washing down a handful of pills with leftover booze and trying to chalk up a line of cocaine off the table from the night before. And I'm completely lost at this point in my life. I feel completely hopeless, suicidal. My life, relationships are a disaster. And I'm kind of living this bad boy gangster lifestyle. And eventually I wind up in Mazatlan, Mexico, and I meet a man that worked for the Sinaloa Cartel. And so in a moment of desperation, I eventually gave in to their invitations to start drug trafficking for them. And eventually I quit working for the cartel, but I was convinced to go back and do that one last run. And it was a setup. And I was busted by the Mexican military and I was thrown in jail for what threatened to be a 10 to 25-year sentence. And so the only thing I really cared about at that point in my life were my dogs. And they were staying with a friend of mine while I was locked up in a concrete cell with 1 hour a week out in the yard where we could talk to people on the phone. And so one day I called my friend Bibi, who was looking after my dogs. And when I talked to her and she answered the phone, I'll never forget what she said. She said, Jeffrey, I'm so sorry. Carmen was killed by another dog's owner after they got in a fight. I'm so sorry. And so the guilt that I felt from leaving her behind, and her image is just burned in my mind. Like I just see this image of her big brown eyes, her big floppy ears, and just wagging her tail. And the thought of having lost that thing that was most important to me in my life felt absolutely devastating. But we get called back into line and filed back up to the cell and squashed back into the 11-foot by 11-foot cell with 30 other men. And so I'm sitting in the corner meditating and sweating because it's like 45 degrees in Mexicali. And I sit there for days on end and really just trying to process this guilt and shame and loss and just struggling with the emotions around that. And eventually I realized that I don't have to suffer anymore. I realized that suffering is a choice and that I'm free. And so just under 2 years after landing in that cell, I was released early by what we could call good luck, el favor de Dios, as they would say in Spanish. And after I got back to Canada, I was able to start to pursue my dreams again, and I was able to travel the world and learn from some of the best known experts in breath and cold and yoga and plant medicine and trauma healing. And I was able to start to rebuild my life. And that pain and the trauma and the suffering that was causing me to numb out and rebel and self-sabotage was no longer running my life. And I was able to experience that true freedom from within. And now today, I help other people find that same freedom and really work with three main pillars of radical ownership, self-mastery, and becoming the conscious creator in our lives. So that's a little bit about where I come from and why I
Yeah,
do the work that I do.
that's an introduction and a half.
Yeah.
So a few quick questions there as well, because it's just like fascinating. Just that's an introduction you literally couldn't make up. What comes first then, the accident before getting involved in with the Sinaloa drug cartel? Was that what happened first?
Yeah, I'd had a number of near-death experiences through my 20s that eventually led to pharmaceutical drug addiction. And I had been struggling with trauma, throughout my life. And had been using recreational drugs to try and hide from that. And as a result of those near-death experiences and the accidents themselves, got led on the path of traditional Western medical treatment for anxiety, depression, PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar, all the things. And OxyContin was a part of that. And that one really got its hooks in me. And often I say to people that the first 2 years of OxyContin use were two of the best years of my life because I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel any of that pain that I'd been hiding from. But after it really got its hooks in, it really started to impact my life. And that combined with the recreational drugs and the unwillingness to face my own pain and to really heal that trauma really took me through some intensely dark places. And eventually that took me to Mexico and I met the cartel.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah,
Obviously, get to the cartel in a moment. How old were you at the time? Because it sounds like you've been through a lot for a long period of time, childhood there, and it's catching up with you, really affecting you. So,
mm.
how old were you around that sort of time when you were really starting to struggle?
The first near-death experience I had, I was 19, and I had been struggling prior to that. Childhood had been a pretty rough time, and at this point, looking back after diving into that pain, I can see that there was also a lot of good as well. Yeah, and there was a lot of great things that happened in childhood, but there was some experiences that left an imprint. And so that first near-death experience started to crack me open. I still didn't quite wake up. I had another one a few years later and another one a couple of years after that. So it kind of spanned through late teens and through my 20s.
How did you get involved with the Sinaloa cartel?
Well, when I left Canada and, wound my way down to Mazatlan, and that was a pretty windy journey that took me through some of the USA's correctional facilities as well. But eventually I got to Mazatlan and I had a fifth wheel trailer, like an RV, and I pulled into an RV park. And it just so happened that this was in July, and so there's hardly anybody in this RV park. There's only a couple other trailers, and I just happened to park beside the one that was owned by the cartel. And so the fellow that worked for the cartel was one of the first people I met when I got to Mazatlan.
When did you realize he was part of the cartel? Did it come up in a conversation, or did you know straight away this guy might be in a cartel?
It was pretty obvious. I met a fellow, and there was a guy staying in the trailer that was trafficking for them at that point. So he kind of gave me the story of what he was doing and who he was working for. Eventually, he kind of, went his own way, and the fellow that owned the trailer became a bit of an acquaintance or a friend. And when I got to Mazatlan, I actually got clean, and I didn't want to work for the cartel despite the invitations. I really wanted to get clean and get my feet back on the ground. And so that's what I did. And I opened up a restaurant. And I had found yoga. So I was a really dedicated student and started teaching yoga and was really just doing my very best to get ahead and rebuild a life. But through my addiction, I had spent the bulk of the money that I had, and I just couldn't get my head above water with the restaurant and with the teaching. And so after a few years of that, I got to a point where I didn't have enough money to pay the rent at my restaurant and the rent at my house as we went into the low season for tourism in Mazatlan. And so we had stayed in contact through that time. And at that point, I was at a rock bottom, and I just couldn't see any other options in terms of how I was going to get myself out of that situation. That felt like the only real option that I had. So I took it and worked with them for a couple of years and then quit working for them. And then eventually got convinced to go back and do that one last run about 6 months after that.
So with the guy that you met in the cartel, was there any ever like pressure on yourself? Can you do this? Can you do that? Or did you just sort of say, "No, that's not for me," and he just left you to it, and you just stayed in contact?
Yeah, it was always pretty friendly,
Yeah,
and I feel lucky in that respect,
yeah,
in that it seemed like a friendly relationship. I'm sure that the potential was there for it to go the other way, and I think oftentimes does.
yeah.
And yet, in my experience, it was a pretty friendly relationship. And when I said I was done, then that wasn't an issue. And it didn't feel like there was pressure to go back and do that one last run, but it was a case of just kind of sweetening the pot to ensure that I would take that bait, essentially.
When you went for the first time, you're looking around, you think, "Oh, I haven't got the money, I've got no other option." And you've made that call, and he said, "Yeah, fine." And I don't know, you have to tell me what happened. You turned up. Did you think, hold on, I'm in my over my head in too deep here? Or did you think, no, do you know what? Let's just do this. It'll be fine. What were you thinking?
Yeah, it's a good question. And even when I'd been in Canada, I'd been wrapped up in different criminal activity through all of the drug addiction, and the people that I was hanging out with in Canada were definitely involved in all of that. And so it wasn't so outside of my realm and so when I decided to do it, there was some fear for sure, because you don't get a lot of information about what you're doing, where you're going, when you're doing it. You're just kind of left in the dark. And so there's a little bit of fear, but there was also a sense of excitement as well, and a sense of adventure. And I'd always been a bit of a risk taker and a thrill seeker. So I was just kind of along for the ride, and figured that it would be okay. And it was for the large part. And really it was a setup in the end that was the final bust.
Definitely come to the setup because that obviously really important part. What would be the normal process of like what would it be classed as? Is it drug running?
Yeah.
Yeah. What would be the normal process from start to finish?
Yeah, I would wait to get a phone call and say, let's go. And then we would go, and I would hop in some type of recreational vehicle, whether it was a motorhome or a truck and trailer or whatever kind of combination they had rigged up that would be full of narcotics. And I would jump in and drive until I got a call that said, we're going to stop here. And that might be in the middle of nowhere. You would
Desert
stop.
stuff.
Yeah, because there's all these relationships and checkpoints that need to be in order to make it through the military checkpoints, and the right people need to be working at the right time and know that you're coming to, in order to wave you through. And so, you're going through these military checkpoints loaded with thousands of kilograms of narcotics, and that everything's good, and everything was, and then you'd stop at some weird other place along the way and just wait for the call. And sometimes we'd be driving through the desert and trying to get around different checkpoints because obviously they couldn't pay people off, and it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Eventually we'd get to the end point, and that'd be somewhere along the border, and get some mechanic shop or tire shop or auto wrecker, and unload, and
What's going through your mind when you get to a check? There's armed like police there or whatever. You
there's a
thinking,
lot of
even
prayer going on, sing the mind, and really practicing a lot of what I teach right now, which is learn being in relationship with the nervous system, and calming yourself down, and just being really present to what's actually happening in that moment, and just responding to the questions that get asked, and just trying to keep that poker face, and yeah, maybe the fingers and the toes are crossed.
so you're in the middle of the desert, something like Breaking Bad, and you're waiting for somebody to turn up. What are you thinking? Are you thinking, I'm just doing a job, right? Let's get to the next bit, or do you have a point where you're thinking, seriously, what am I doing here? How did it come to this? Have you ever had any sort of points like that?
Yeah, there is lots of those moments for sure of what the hell am I doing here? And there's also fear of other cartels, and not just military and police, and there's just like, man, I hope I get through this.
Obviously, Sinaloa Cartel is apparently the most violent one of the cartels. You're going to be aware of that. Are you thinking I could have put myself in danger regardless, even if I've done my job? What are you thinking there about being in that position? Because I mean, if I'm probably on the same continent as Sinaloa Cartel, I'm probably fearing for my safety, you know?
Yeah, I think I had a bit of a different perspective. The first time I went to Mexico was in 1986, and I was with my mom and dad and brother, and we flew into Puerto Vallarta and rented a car and drove to Ixtapa, which is quite a ways away. For much of that time, at that time, the cartels were very much more out in the open. And so we were driving through fields and fields of marijuana plantations. And there was guys in pickup trucks with machine guns, that we were following behind and would escort us through different areas of these provinces. And so I think I had a really early introduction to, and maybe a little bit of a distorted view, where it wasn't just kind of something that I was seeing on the news. My life had been, had been involved in drugs, and in that crowd of people my whole life. So it didn't seem that far out of the ordinary. And maybe I didn't have as much fear as a normal person might, or maybe as much consideration of the danger that I was putting myself in. I knew this guy. We had a pretty good relationship, and it seemed like everything was going to be okay. And I never really thought a lot about the consequences of either jail or what could have potentially happened with the cartel.
Were you always on like the periphery of it? The guys like, yeah, come and do a job. It's not like you see in like Mexican narcos where you turn up at some big house where there's like loads of like the actual cartel there or anything like that? Were you just there on the outside just doing a job and then that was it, getting paid?
Pretty much, yeah. There was times of interaction with, with different people or, groups of people. We might meet up with a bunch of cartel bosses in some tiny little town on the ocean and, and have a meal together and sit down and eat mariscos, as they say in Mexico, and have a fish, and there's a bunch of cartel guys there, and but again it wasn't so far removed from the life that I had known that it was that unusual, and I think, to kind of add to that previous point, I think I was also just at a point of desperation, and I'd gone through so much just to get to Mexico, and to try and rebuild my life. And that hadn't worked, and I didn't feel like I really had any options. You're just doing what you can to survive. And so, we can really normalize really unusual situations when they've been normalized through our experience and exposure to them. So I think it just didn't seem really that weird to me. I'd always had a fascination. I grew up a really good student, went off to university to become a neurosurgeon. I was valedictorian in my class. But I always had a fascination with both narcotics, psychedelics, and so even in my drug use, I was studying the cartels, like I was reading books about Pablo Escobar and the
Yeah,
cocaine trade in the US and the 19, I wasn't maybe like a typical addict, I was always interested in the behind the scenes and biker gangs and all
yeah.
of that. Yeah, there's always a kind of a fascination there.
So you do your first run. How much money did you get paid for that?
I feel like I don't know if I want to share that on here. I
Okay.
feel like it's kind of keep those details.
Yeah, no, I just
Yeah,
yeah, no, that's absolutely fine because obviously you got your restaurant there as well. But obviously,
yeah.
when you get X amount of money, it becomes very difficult to then turn it down, and then you
Mhm.
kind of carry on. Did you find that that was probably the case for yourself at that time? It's too good an opportunity to turn down. It's been successful. We're going to carry on.
Really, a lot of it was based on survival. It was, it was making decisions based on trying to get my head above water.
Yeah,
And when I did eventually get to that point where I thought, okay, I think I can make this work. And, I'm not like I was millions of dollars ahead, but I had a strong enough foundation. The
yeah,
restaurant was going pretty well. Yoga was going pretty good at that point. It was like, okay, I think I'm good. I'm gonna
yeah.
get out of this and
Easy
just
enough to
focus on the other parts of life.
easy enough to get out of.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it was very simple. Just saying that, yeah, I'm done.
Yeah. And then you've got the notorious one last run. What happened
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, well, it was a wild experience in that, I had quit and I was super focused on the restaurant and the teaching. And I had a gentleman come into the restaurant one night, and it turned out that he was an angel investor. And he had kind of been following what I'd been doing and, coming to the restaurant and different things I'd been doing. And he asked me to come sit down. And that same night that I made the decision to do the one last run, he called me over to ask if he could invest in my restaurant and help me expand and franchise. And I'm literally sitting there talking to
Yeah.
him. My friend that works for the cartel drives down the road, and I can see him coming from way far away. And so it's just this
Sliding doors
decision point,
moment.
and I think a lot of times we just make decisions based upon what we know, and even if the future looks like a better option, it's still unknown, maybe there's an easy path, but it's not something that we've experienced before. And so there can be a default to the devil that we know, rather than the one that we don't. And so it was, I think, a situation where I thought, like I said, they kind of sweetened the pot. And it was like, okay, if I do this, then I really will be securely ahead and I'll be okay and I can get on with my life. And so I told the investor, I got to take off for a week. I'll be back and let's do this thing with the restaurant. And I never made it back.
When you did the final run, did anything feel off? Anything feel different to any of the other times?
Yeah. Yeah, there was clues for sure.
What?
Yeah, it was a different sequence. It was a double run. So I made a run up to Tijuana, went back to this place where we used to stage, but we were staging in a different place than we usually did. It took a lot longer, so I was kind of waiting and waiting and waiting. Finally, the guy that I knew came to get me to go and do the second run. And I got in the motorhome and turned around, shook his hand, and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "Good luck." And he never spoke to me in English. And there was I knew something was up, but also, what do you do at that point? And you're hoping that nothing's up. And yet there's an underlying knowing on some level. And I think probably a lot of people can relate to different situations where it's like we know something's not quite right, but we don't really know what to do about it. We don't have the trust in ourselves to listen to that intuition. And so I knew something was going on, but I went ahead anyways.
By this time, have you got like a sixth sense? You don't think something's not right. You know, but you don't know what.
Mm.
Yeah. If you're already thinking, is somebody? What is this a sting? So is that kind of what's going through your mind, or you're still not sure what it is, but something's wrong?
I didn't really know what was going on. It it just felt like there's something wasn't in alignment. There was something different, but I didn't know what that thing was. And so you're just hoping, right? It's
Yeah.
just like, no, and the mind can do crazy
Yeah.
things and convincing us. It's like, oh no, it's going to be okay. And we override those sensations in the body. We override our intuition. And how many people listening can relate to that, prior to an accident or some type of event in their life coming up, and they had some kind of an inclination that that was coming and yet chose to do the thing anyways.
Could you have done anything different, or were you where the wheels were set in motion, even though you're thinking something's not right? Could you have like pulled out, or did you still just have to carry on and go through with what you had set out to do?
I feel like looking back, yeah, hindsight's always 2020, right? And so, yes, there was different possibilities, but I feel like it's a bit of a moot point at this point. I did what I did, what happened,
Yeah.
happened. And, we can look back and say, was there possibilities, to do something different? I'm sure there was, but that wasn't what I did.
So what happened then? Was it like a load of like what feds or military just come out of nowhere when you're
No, it
what was the
it
sting
was
like?
a setup at a military checkpoint, and the DEA
Yeah.
and the Mexican military had a deal where the DEA from the US had given the Mexican military a bunch of new mobile X-ray machines that they could use to scan vehicles. And so the cartel, the military, the DEA, they're all wrapped up with one another. They're all working with one another, and yet they present this facade to the public that they're, the war on drugs, but really we all know that the CIA, DEA are some of the biggest drug dealers in the world. And so yet they present a facade to the public, and so all of the military receives all of these x-ray machines, they need to, create some type of a show for the public that, oh yeah, these new x-ray machines are going to stop the flow of drugs into the US. And so they staged a bust, actually two busts. There's another fellow after me that got busted as well. And so I drove into a military checkpoint. Something was definitely different at the checkpoint when I was driving in. Usually I would take one path down off the road. They'd kind of do their little check in air quotes, and I would keep going on. But that day there was clearly this new machine sitting in the middle of the road and they were like, just go straight. And so I tried to just go off the road like I normally would, just kind of pretending I didn't understand. And they're like, no, you need to go back.
Was that then when you thought we're in trouble?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I backed up, went through the machine, and they already knew I was coming. So they were excited to see me.
So you're getting arrested, and the next thing you know, you're in the prison, you got caught. How does that work?
Well, yeah, funny thing is they're so excited about this bus that they took me out of the motorhome and sat me underneath a tree by myself. And so I'm sitting underneath this tree with a handbag that's got my computer, all my ID, and $10,000 US in it. And so I'm sitting there kind of watching this whole thing unfold, and there's military guys and they're ripping the motorhome apart, and they're all completely occupied over there. And I'm just sitting there by myself. And I'm thinking like, I wonder if I can get out of this.
Were you tempted?
Oh, yeah. So I thought this is basically like an oasis in the desert. It's a place called El Doctor. And so it's
Right.
kind of this forested area in the middle of the desert. And I think
Right.
to myself, well, like if I could like sneak off and make my way around back to the other side, I bet I could give somebody that $10,000, and I bet that they would probably drive really fast and get me out of here. And so I kind of try it out by walking over to go to the washroom. Nobody's looking away and far enough that I could start running, and I start desert trying to make my way around, and got quite a ways before I heard some gunshots and a Hummer driving up behind me.
It sounds like a movie. And how long after that incident were you sentenced to prison in Mexico, which sounds scary?
Sorry, I just lost you there for a minute.
How long after you been like arrested, were you sent to prison? How long did that take? How long was that process?
I think